As she lay there, her thoughts drifting between exhaustion and the quiet ache of loneliness, she heard a knock at the door. It was late, much too late for visitors. The sound startled her. She sat up, her heart racing slightly. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, thinking it might be the wind or some stray animal, but the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. She grabbed a shawl, wrapped it around her shoulders, and made her way to the door. Her feet moved slowly, each step heavy with an inexplicable sense of dread. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment before opening it. Akua had been a young woman when her husband, Yodako, left for the city of Accra. They had built their life in the village of Nyamejoa, where the trees were tall, the land rich, and the village quiet. Though, was never content with the quiet life of a farmer. He was restless, driven by ambition and a hunger for something more, something bigger. The city called to him like a distant drum, the promise of wealth and success echoing in his mind. He talked endlessly about how life in Accra would be the key to their family's future, how he would return with riches beyond their imagination. So, one morning, Yo packed his bags, kissed Akua and their two young children, Kofi and Ajoa, and set off for Accra. At first, Yo kept his promises. Letters arrived from the city, filled with stories of opportunity and the bustling life in Accra. He spoke of new business ventures, important people he had met, and how he was just on the brink of making it big. Akua would read these letters aloud to their children, her heart swelling with hope that Yo would soon return and they would live the life he had always dreamed of. But as the months wore on, the letters began to dwindle. The once regular correspondence became sporadic, and then, without warning, they stopped altogether. Akua sent word to Accra through relatives and friends, asking about Yo, but no one had any news. It was as if he had vanished. After a year with no word, the whispers began in the village. People murmured that Yo had abandoned his family, that he had found another woman in the city, or that he had gotten mixed up in dangerous dealings. Akua tried to keep her faith, but as more time passed, she was forced to accept that Yo was gone. It wasn't until 3 years later that word finally reached Nyamejoa, Yodako was dead. The news had come from a distant cousin who had heard it through a friend in Accra. Yo had died under mysterious circumstances, they said. There were no details, no explanation, nobody sent back for burial. It was as if Yo had disappeared from the world entirely. Akua was devastated, but there was nothing she could do. Without a body to bury, without any real closure, she grieved in silence. The village, too, seemed to accept Yo's fate with a quiet understanding. Nyamejoa had seen its fair share of strange deaths and mysterious disappearances over the years, and Yo's case was just one more to add to the list. Life went on. Akua worked hard to raise Kofi and Ajoa on her own, tending to the farm and doing her best to keep her family together. Years passed, and though the pain of Yo's absence never truly left her, she learned to live with it. Yo's name was rarely spoken anymore, and the memory of him became a shadow, something to be buried along with the many other losses Nyamejoa had suffered over the generations. But the dead do not always stay buried, and some shadows do not fade with time. It was a humid evening, years after Yo's disappearance, when the first strange occurrence happened. Akua was in her room, lying on her bed and staring at the ceiling. The day had been long, and her body was aching from the endless work of tending to the farm. Kofi and Ajoa were now teenagers, and though they helped her, the burden of raising them alone weighed heavily on her. As she lay there, her thoughts drifting between exhaustion and the quiet ache of loneliness, she heard a knock at the door. It was late, much too late for visitors. The sound startled her. She sat up, her heart racing slightly. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, thinking it might be the wind or some stray animal, but the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. She grabbed a shawl, wrapped it around her shoulders, and made her way to the door. Her feet moved slowly, each step heavy with an inexplicable sense of dread. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment before opening it. Standing there, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon, was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, and familiar. Too familiar. Akira's heart seemed to stop in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. It was Yo. Her husband, the man who had left for Accra all those years ago and never returned, stood before her, looking exactly as he had the day he left. His face was smooth, untouched by time. His clothes were the same ones he had worn when he left, as though he had just stepped out for a quick errand and returned home. But there was something wrong, something terribly wrong. Akira stared at him, her voice lost, her mind racing. How could this be? Yo was dead. She had mourned him, accepted his death, buried him in her heart. And yet, here he was. Yo, she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled at her, a strange, empty smile. Akira, he said, his voice as familiar as ever, but there was an unnatural calmness to it. I've come home. Akira felt her legs weaken, and she grabbed the doorframe for support. How are you here? They said you were dead. Yo took a step forward, his movements too smooth, too fluid. I never left, Akira. I've always been close. Akira's mind screamed that this wasn't right, that the man standing before her wasn't her husband. Her instincts told her to run, to shut the door and lock it, but she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, caught between disbelief and terror. Yo walked past her, into the house, and sat down at the old wooden table in the middle of the room. It was the same table where they had once shared meals, where they had laughed and dreamed of their future. But now, it felt wrong, as though his presence in the house disturbed the very air around them. Where have you been? Akira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to you? Yo's expression darkened for a moment, but then the strange smile returned. I've been in many places. I've seen things you wouldn't understand. But none of that matters now. I'm here. Akira stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Are you real? Your smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. I'm as real as you remember me, he said, but his eyes were cold, distant, as though the man sitting before her wasn't truly Yo, but something else, something wearing his face. The night seemed to stretch on forever, with Yo sitting at the table, silent and still, while Akira watched him, fear and confusion swirling inside her. She didn't dare to ask any more questions, and Yo offered no further explanations. He simply sat there, staring at her with those hollow eyes, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. Then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, Yo stood up, walked to the door, and vanished into the early morning mist. Akira was left standing in the doorway, her heart racing, her mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. She convinced herself that it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and grief. But deep down, she knew better. The next night, Yo returned again. And the night after that. Each time, he appeared at the door, the same strange smile on his face, the same unsettling calm in his voice. He never answered her questions, never explained where he had been or how he was still alive. He would simply sit at the table, watching her in silence, until the dawn broke and he would vanish once more. Word spread quickly through the village. People began to whisper about Yo's return, and the old fears and superstitions resurfaced. The elders gathered, their faces grave as they discussed the implications of Yo's reappearance.